This podcast is being recorded on May 6th, and we are beginning another month of coping with the pandemic of 2020. We are still staying at home. We are still maintaining social distancing. We continue to worry about the economy, our health, and the future, and we are still reading. Although everyone sees and feels the effects of the pandemic, I think those of us who live in Wooddale and Bensonville, Des Plaines, Elk Grove Village, and the other communities around O'Hare see those effects and hear those effects in a more graphic way than others. Remember the days after 9/11 when all air travel was stopped? Those of O'Hare quickly became aware of the eerie silence. Instead of an overhead roar every 2 or 3 minutes, we heard nothing. It was unnerving, and it brought the prospect of terror closer than it had ever been before. Now, I live in a tall building right on the edge of O'Hare, and as I stand outdoors on my balcony, I am just a few hundred feet from the end of the southernmost runway. I also have a view of the rest of the airport, and I love that view. Despite the noise, I love to sit and watch the planes come and go, especially at night, when the sky view to the east may have over 20 planes lined up across the horizon as they make their final approach to O'Hare. And I love watching the huge planes on the ground as they lumber about awkwardly to get into position to take off. And then when they do, they transform into the most graceful, beautiful machines gliding up and away. Now, though, the runway closest to me is closed, and it has become a parking lot for idle jets. They are lined up from one end to the other, never moving. It is a sad and frightening sight. Across the airport, I see other planes on other runways that are parked and waiting for something. And the lights at night are missing. There's very little air traffic during the day and virtually none after dark. Life changed forever on 9/11, and life is now changing again as the pandemic moves across the country and around the world. But through it all, one thing did not change and will never change: the joy and escape of reading. So here are 7 titles for your consideration, each of which is available as an ebook through Hoopla. First, a book published way back in 1968, and those of us of a certain age all read it, the phenomenally popular Airport by Arthur Haley. The novel covers 7 nail-bitingly tense hours as a blizzard rages in Chicago. The airport, Lincoln International, struggles to stay open while a plane damaged by a bomb must make an emergency landing. You may remember that Lincoln International was modeled on O'Hare International, and the overview of a major airport in crisis remains just as applicable today, over 50 years later. If you could not put this book down 50 years ago, chances are good you will be reading it again. Next, consider a nonfiction title, A History of Chicago's O'Hare International Airport by Michael Brannigan. In 1942, a stretch of Illinois prairie that had served as a battleground and a railroad depot became the site of a major manufacturing plant producing Douglas C-54 Skymasters for World War II. Less than 20 years later, that plot of land boasted the biggest and busiest airport in the world. Many of the millions who have since passed through it have likely only regarded it as a place between cities. But for people like Michael Brannigan, who has spent years on its tarmac, they know that O'Hare is a city unto itself, with a fascinating history of gangsters, heroes, mayors, presidents, and pilots. This book is the history of one of the greatest airports in the world and you will read stories you have never heard about happenings behind the scenes at O'Hare International. If you fly into or out of Chicago, you will pass through O'Hare or Midway. And when we think of Chicago airports, those are the two with which we're all familiar. But in fact, there were others, many others, and another nonfiction title tells their story. It's called Lost Airports of Chicago, and it was written by Michael Selig. Today, these airports and landing strips are buried under shopping malls and housing developments, and they have been long forgotten. But in fact, these airports that sprang up after World War II played a critical role in the development of modern aviation. For example, there was a Wilson Airport located where Lawrence Avenue crossed the Des Plaines River and River Road just outside of Schiller Park. There was also an airport in Elmhurst. The story of these airports are little known and provide fascinating reading if you have any interest at all in little-known Chicago history. For a third book, coming back to modern times, consider the book by Alan Gallup called Heathrow Airport, Yesterday, Today, and Tomorrow. Heathrow currently serves just under 200 routes to more than 90 countries, and its history over the last 70 years is filled with controversy and conflict, much like the history of O'Hare. The 23 chapters of the book cover the whole story, from Heathrow's beginning, when a series of grass airfields were positioned around London during World War I to counter the Zeppelin threat. The real meat of the book for aviation enthusiasts can be found in later chapters as we read through the development of the airport, particularly from the late 1940s and through the jet age. Bob Helchlinsky has written a fascinating book, especially for those of us living in the Midwest. Its title is, get ready, Honey, I Bought an Airplane, Stories, Histories, and Recollections of 597 Flights in the Midwest. That really is the title of the book. The book is a series of stories about flying into small airports in Illinois, Indiana, Wisconsin, and other Midwestern states. You will read things here you never knew about John Dillinger, Al Capone, a World War II pilot named O'Hare, backroad encounters on Mackinac Island, and how not to fly under the bridge, outmaneuvering storm clouds, the Oshkosh Air Show, close-knit neighborhoods with hangar garages, airports in Ohio, police in Gary, Indiana, the link between Northwestern University and a historic Lake Michigan passenger ferry tragedy, and how a teenager's happy birthday flight launched a career, and much, much, much more. Consider also a book by Michael Vlasides called The Ice Pilots, Flying with the Mavericks of the Great White North. The book follows renegade Arctic airline Buffalo Airways and pilots who defy the cold and the competition by using World War II-era propeller planes who hauled vital fuel, supplies, and passengers to remote outposts across the world's last great wilderness. From rookie pilots trying to earn their wings in sometimes terrible conditions to vintage planes that flew over Normandy on D-Day, The Ice Pilots brings its readers on an engaging romp through the Arctic skies. The nonfiction book shares behind-the-scenes stories about the ice pilots, the crew, and the communities they serve. Weaving in history about bush pilots, plane crashes, and the North, the author has crafted an entertaining, informative narrative about aviation, the lifeline of this remote world. And finally, though I've not yet finished reading it, I can already recommend TSA Baggage, an inside look at the bad, the good, and the ugly of Americans' airports. The author, Scott Becker, spent 13 years working for the Transportation Security Agency at O'Hare International Airport. And this book is an insider story of the TSA, the second most hated agency of the federal government. Number 1 on that list, by the way, is, that's right, the IRS. Baker says that his goal in writing the book was to humanize the people of TSA, to show some of the funny and horrible things that the officers are exposed to every day, and some of the good things that TSA officers and passengers do for each other. He also recognizes the fact that TSA has had a terrible reputation, and he concedes that TSA is indeed responsible for that reputation. He believes, though, that the bad apples among TSA agents are not the norm, and that a workforce of 56,000 people with a turnover rate of 20,000 per year is automatically subject to bad hires. All of the stories in the book took place at O'Hare International Airport over the past 15 years, and most are first-hand experiences of the author. If you are a frequent flyer or someone who avoids air travel whenever possible, this book will affect you. You may laugh and you may shed a tear. You may cringe with second-hand embarrassment, but you will be fascinated by this inside look at one of the ways life changed forever after 9/11. Again, I remind you, these books are all available through Hoopla. You access Hoopla through the Wooddale Public Library homepage, and downloading a book takes just a few seconds. Hoopla offers audiobooks as well if you prefer listening. There is no charge for this amazing service. We know that the planes being stored on the runway across from where I live will eventually be put back into service, and the moving lights in the night sky will be visible again. Until then, though, we can fly anywhere at any time through books. Thanks for listening.